I'd like to begin with some words of Abraham Lincoln, magnificently eloquent as usual. This was his great message to Congress of December 1862. Fellow citizens, we cannot escape history. We of this Congress and this administration will be remembered in spite of ourselves. No personal significance or insignificance can spare one or another of us. The fiery trial through which we pass will light us down in honor or dishonor to the latest generation. I think it's fair to say that our constitutional order today, ever in the process of formulation and revision as it attempts to forge its way into the future, is in many ways going through its own fiery trial. The war of terror is confronting us with more wrenching constitutional issues at home affecting civil liberties than any war we have ever fought, with the exception of the Civil War. It's no wonder then that as a nation we are now in the midst of what I believe to be the most heated and consequential debates about the powers and responsibilities of the president than we've seen since the Civil War. Of course, very serious constitutional issues, including civil liberties at home, were faced by the presidents who steered us through the two world wars. Both Lincoln and FDR engaged in acts that, at least in hindsight, seem to be clear and extreme violations of the Constitution. But no president since Lincoln has faced a threat with so many pressing civil liberties implications at home as George W. Bush. So it's fitting, I think, that the Historical Society would convene a meeting to compare the approaches of these two presidents. Of course, to compare any current president in crisis to compare them to the incomparable Lincoln runs a serious risk of invidious comparison. On that, though, I think it's worth reflecting, and I wonder if the Justice would agree with me, that if this society had sponsored a discussion in 1861 or 1862 comparing Lincoln, then in office, to, say, Washington, I imagine the room would have been filled with bitter denunciations. Let's begin by talking with our two distinguished authors about Lincoln and the Civil War. Justice, can you sum up the main civil liberties issues that were raised by what Lincoln did on the home front during the Civil War?
I'll try. First of all, thank you very much for that warm welcome. I don't usually get applauded when I take the bench on the Supreme Court in Rhode Island. Just a lot of frowning faces. But Dean,
You're not planning to rule against this audience.
That's right. Well, that'll depend on how you rule against us or me. But it's good to be here, and I commend, as the Dean, and I know Mike feels the same way, the New York Historical Society, doing this very important conversation in these very trying times. I never thought, as a lawyer and judge and historian, that I would be living through the times that we're now living through, with the similar issues that Abraham Lincoln confronted and other presidents confronted in our history. But to get to the Dean's query, let me read just briefly from a newspaper. It's dated January 16, 2006. Congressional leaders were outraged by the president's decision to deny American citizens a most basic constitutional right. Newspaper editors condemned the president. Lawyers, jurists, civic leaders, academicians, clergy, and others joined in the attack. It was not believed that any law was violated, the president said in response to his many critics. Well, is this a description of President George W. Bush and his response to September 11th and thereafter, and his decision to detain non-U.S. citizens in Guantanamo Bay? One could conclude that, but actually it's Abraham Lincoln that they're talking about here. And in a nutshell, civil liberties was a major issue, beginning with the firing on Fort Sumter on April 12, 1861, with a fairly inexperienced president. Remember, he had only served 3 months as a militiaman in the Black Hawk War in 1832, and now he's the chief magistrate. There were times when Lincoln would say, chief of what? And he also was our commander-in-chief. He's apoplectic. The nation's capital is surrounded. Virginia, now part of the Confederacy. Maryland threatening to join the Confederacy. The rail lines between the District of Columbia and Philadelphia being besieged by guerrillas, cutting telegraph lines, destroying bridges. People in Maryland leading an effort to succeed. And Lincoln is wondering what he should do. Of course, he first calls out the militia, does so without congressional authority. Congress is not in session, wouldn't meet until special session on July 4th, 1861. He does a whole number of other things. He declares a blockade of the southern coast, which is an act of war. Congress is empowered to declare war. He appropriates money for the purchase of arms and munitions without congressional authorization. And he does one thing that really led to the major criticism of him and his administration throughout the entire war. He authorizes the suspension of that precious writ of habeas corpus. When I was a trial judge, I used to sign a habeas every day to order the warden to bring in prisoners the following day to have their detention checked by a magistrate. Well, that right to have your imprisonment checked is suspended. Now, our Constitution permits it, Article 1, Section 9, in cases of rebellion or invasion when the public safety requires it. Lincoln authorizes General Winfield Scott to suspend the writ of habeas corpus on the line, the railroad line from Washington to Philadelphia. But Lincoln, the lawyer now, knows what a valuable right this is that we have, this constitutional guarantee. And he tells Scott, if necessary, you can bombard Baltimore, but only in the extremest necessity are you to suspend the writ. Well, the writ was suspended. People were arrested and detained without the chance to have their imprisonment checked. This winds up before the Chief Justice of the United States in the case of John Merriman, who was caught raising troops for the Confederacy, not the Union, in Maryland. He's detained in Fort McHenry in Baltimore Harbor, and his lawyers and friends go to Chief Justice Taney, not a friend of Lincoln's, and Taney issues the habeas corpus to bring Merriman's body before the court. Well, the fort commanding general refuses to honor the writ, and Taney sits down and writes this famous opinion. It's really an in-chambers opinion because it's not the full court meeting, called Ex parte.